One wrong message changed everything. A husband, a wife, and a truth that could shatter their family forever. What if the person you trusted most was hiding the darkest secret? Stay with me till the end, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that keep you hooked. I wasn't expecting anything unusual that evening. The dishes were still stacked in the sink, the kettle hummed low on the stove, and my phone buzzed on the counter. A new voice note from my son. I thought it would be the usual. Something about picking up the kids, or maybe just a casual hello. I pressed play without thinking, wiping my hands on a towel. The first few seconds were ordinary enough. His voice familiar, quick, almost distracted. Then suddenly the words shifted. He mentioned me, but not the way I had ever imagined hearing myself described. It was careless, unguarded, said with the ease of someone speaking to a partner behind closed doors. Words not meant for me. She never changes, he said, his tone tired, sharp around the edges. It's always the same with her. Sometimes I just wish she'd stop interfering, stop making everything about herself. My hand froze midair, the towel still damp against my palm. I stared at the phone, as if maybe the message would stop itself, as if maybe I had heard wrong. But the recording kept going, each sentence pressing heavier against me. You know how she is, he sighed. I can't deal with it anymore. I don't even know why I keep trying. That was all. The voice note clicked off with a small digital pop. The room fell into a silence that seemed louder than his words. The kettle had stopped humming. The clock on the wall ticked faintly, but all I could hear was his voice replaying in my head, over and over. I had to sit down. My body felt heavier than it had a moment before, as if I had aged years in the span of 30 seconds. I replayed the message once more, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to be sure. And there it was again. The same tone, the same words, unchanged. I set the phone face down on the table, as though turning it away could undo what I had heard. My chest ached, not with anger at first, but with something deeper, a kind of hollowing disappointment. I had always thought that no matter what happened in life, no matter how far he went or how much he changed, there was a bond between us that stayed intact. But hearing his voice like that, so casual, so certain, it cracked something I had always believed was unbreakable. I thought of calling him immediately. I imagined my voice trembling as I asked, "What did you mean by that? Is that really how you see me?" But even in my hurt, I knew it wasn't the right moment. If he could say those things so easily to his wife, then whatever answer he gave me in the heat of confrontation wouldn't be honest. It would only be defensive, so I stayed quiet. I picked up the towel again and wiped the counter, though it was already clean. My movements felt slow, automatic, as if doing something ordinary could pull me back into a world where nothing had been said. But I couldn't escape it. His words followed me into every corner of the kitchen, every step I took down the hall, every shadow in the living room. It wasn't that he had criticized me. Families do that. Children, even grown ones, often carry frustrations they can't always voice directly. What cut deeper was the tone, the tiredness in his voice, the way he seemed to believe what he said without hesitation. That was the part I couldn't shake. I sat in my chair by the window, the same chair where I had read him bedtime stories when he was small, the same chair where I waited for him to come home late as a teenager. I remembered his little hands tugging at my sleeve, his laughter echoing through the room. I remembered the long nights sitting by his side when he was sick, whispering that everything would be all right. Those memories felt like they belonged to a different life now. How had we come from there to here? I let the question hang in the air, unanswered. When the phone buzzed again, I flinched. This time it was a short message. "Sorry, that was meant for Sarah." No explanation. No acknowledgement of what I had just heard. Just a brief, almost careless correction, as though misplacing words was the same as misplacing an umbrella. I stared at that line for a long time. Part of me wanted to reply with a single word, "I know." Another part of me wanted to write out everything I was feeling in paragraphs too long to fit on a phone screen. But I didn't respond at all. My silence felt safer. I placed the phone face down again and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The truth was already out. He had said it. He had meant it enough to say it without hesitation. Whether he would admit it or not, those words were his. The evening carried on around me. The dishes still waited in the sink. The kettle had cooled. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one. But inside, I felt a shift. Something small, but irreversible. It wasn't the dramatic shattering of a relationship. It was quieter than that. It was like a crack running through glass, thin, almost invisible, but once it's there, you can never look at the glass the same way again. I thought of calling an old friend, someone who might listen without judgment, but I didn't. This felt too raw, too personal, almost shameful. I couldn't bear to put it into words yet. Instead, I folded a blanket over my lap and sat with the silence. I tried to remind myself that one message did not erase years of love, years of shared moments, but the weight of it pressed against me all the same. I told myself I would sleep, that maybe the morning would bring clarity, or at least a softer ache. But even as I climbed into bed, the words followed me. She never changes. She always makes it about herself. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, realizing that sometimes the hardest truths are the ones you stumble on by accident. And once you hear them, there is no going back to not knowing. That night, the house felt too quiet. And I knew deep down that nothing between us would ever feel quite the same again. I didn't play the message again. I didn't need to. Once was enough to etch it into my mind. The strange thing about words is how little space they take up in the air, yet how much room they claim inside of you. His voice, so steady, so certain, seemed to echo louder in silence than it had in sound. The next morning I moved through the house like a ghost in my own life. The kettle boiled, the radio mumbled in the background, the clock ticked its way forward. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt familiar. It was as if his words had bent the shape of the rooms, rearranged the air I breathed. I tried to distract myself with ordinary tasks. Folding laundry, watering plants, stirring a pot of soup, but each motion carried me back to what I'd heard. Every quiet moment stretched long enough for his sentences to replay. She never changes. She always makes it about herself. The repetition carved deeper with every recall. What unsettled me most wasn't just the criticism. It was the comfort in his tone, the way he spoke as if these were truths long agreed upon, not fleeting frustrations. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't venting. He was stating facts, at least as he believed them. I caught myself staring at the phone on the table, waiting for another message, some attempt to explain or soften what he had said. But nothing came. His silence matched mine, and in that silence the distance between us stretched. Later that day, I saw him. He stopped by briefly with the children. He hugged me, kissed my cheek, asked how I was. His voice was warm, casual, untouched by the sharpness I had heard only hours earlier. For a moment I wondered if I had imagined it, if exhaustion had twisted his words into something they weren't. But I knew better. The memory was too clear. I found myself watching him differently, noticing small things I had overlooked before. The slight impatience in his sigh when the kids asked for too much at once. The way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He was tired, stretched thin, carrying weight I hadn't seen clearly until then. And yet, even knowing that, the words he had spoken still sat between us like a wall neither of us acknowledged. That evening, after they left, I sat in the quiet again. The house had always felt still after visits, but now it felt empty in a different way. Not just quiet, hollow. I poured a glass of water, held it without drinking, and asked myself questions I had never dared before. Had I interfered too much? Had I leaned on him in ways I shouldn't have? Had my love for him turned into something heavier than support, something he carried as a burden instead of a gift? The questions circled me, slow and relentless. I wanted to believe I had been the mother he needed. But what if the years had carved out a different truth? One I had been too close to see. I remembered a conversation years ago when he was still in college. He had called late at night, frustrated about money. "You don't understand," he said then, his voice sharp. "You think everything can be fixed the way you fixed things when I was a kid. But it's not that simple anymore." At the time, I had brushed it off as youthful impatience. Now, replaying it in the shadow of his recent words, It sounded like the beginning of a distance I had never acknowledged. I wished I could talk to someone about it, but shame held me back. To repeat his words aloud felt like admitting failure, not just as a mother, but as the person he believed me to be. And so I carried it quietly, turning it over in my mind, night after night. There were moments when I almost convinced myself to let it go, to treat it as nothing more than the careless spill of a tired man. But each time the echo returned, reminding me that carelessness often reveals more than intention hides. One evening, I sat with a photo album spread across my lap. Pictures of birthdays, graduations, holidays lined the pages. His smile through the years changed from wide-eyed boyhood to the steady calm of adulthood. In every image, I saw myself in the background, holding, supporting, watching. It should have comforted me, but instead, it sharpened the question: had I given too much of myself in ways he hadn't wanted? When the phone buzzed days later with another message from him, my heart leapt before I even read it. But it was ordinary. Can you watch the kids tomorrow? Simple, routine. Not an inch of acknowledgement about what had happened. I typed yes and nothing more. It struck me then that life often continues on the surface, while the ground underneath shifts completely. We spoke as usual, acted as usual, moved through the same motions, but inside, I carried something new, something that made every interaction heavier. In the quiet of those days, I came to a realization. What hurt most wasn't that my son had spoken poorly of me. What hurt most was learning that the way I saw our relationship and the way he experienced it were not the same, and that gap, silent, invisible, yet undeniable, was where the echo lived. I lay awake at night, staring into the dark, wondering if he would ever know what his words had done to me. And if he did, would it matter to him the way it mattered to me, or would he brush it off as nothing, leaving me alone with the echo that never left? I didn't know the answer. All I knew was that I had crossed into a place I could not return from, a place where trust wasn't destroyed in an explosion but eroded slowly, in the quiet repetition of words never meant to be heard. And so, I stayed silent, carrying it inside, listening to the echo after silence, knowing it was mine alone to bear. The days after the message felt like moving through water. Everything was slower, heavier. My body went through the motions, but my mind was never really present. I'd wash the dishes, fold laundry, sweep the floor, but inside there was a constant replay of that moment. His voice, so casual, speaking about me as though I wasn't a person, just a burden on his calendar. I wanted to tell myself it didn't matter, that I was imagining things, but the truth had already settled, and no matter how much I tried to push it aside, it clung to me. The silence between us grew without a word being exchanged. He called less, visited less, and when he did, I could feel something different in the way he spoke to me. It wasn't unkind, not outright, but there was a tiredness, an edge I had never noticed before. One afternoon, I was hanging clothes outside, the sun falling across the yard. My neighbor, Mrs. Ahmed, waved from her balcony. She asked if my son would be visiting for the weekend, like he used to. I smiled politely, gave some vague answer, and went back to pinning shirts on the line. I didn't have the courage to say out loud what I now knew, that my son had started living his life in a way that no longer included me. The quiet distance wasn't just in his actions. It was in me too. I found myself withdrawing from the conversations I used to enjoy, the little details I used to share. If he called, I kept it short. If he asked if I was okay, I said yes, even though my chest ached with words I couldn't form. I had always thought honesty was the bridge between us, but now honesty felt like something that could destroy what little remained. There were nights when I couldn't sleep. I'd sit by the window, the streetlights casting a dull glow on the empty road outside. I remembered the times when he was small, when he'd wake crying, and I'd rock him until his body melted against mine, trusting me to keep him safe. I remembered the afternoons I skipped meals so he wouldn't feel the pinch of hunger. Those sacrifices had always been private, done quietly, because love never asks for applause. But now, I wondered if love given silently was too easy to forget. One evening, I finally tried to speak. He had come by after work, his tie loosened, his eyes tired. We sat at the table, I poured him tea, the way I always did. My hands shook a little, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "Do you ever think," I asked, "about how things used to be?" He looked up surprised. "What do you mean? Just when you were younger, how close we were." He smiled faintly, distracted, stirring his cup. "Of course, Amma, but things change. Life gets busy, you know." His answer was gentle, but it landed like a stone. I nodded, pretending to agree. Inside, though, I felt the sharp reminder that his busyness was another name for distance. I wanted to ask if he still needed me, if he still saw me as someone who mattered in his life, or just a responsibility he carried, but the words stayed locked in my chest. That night, after he left, I sat alone at the table, staring at his untouched biscuit on the plate. I thought about how love changes over time, how it shifts shape, sometimes in ways we don't notice until it's already happened. Parents give without keeping count, but children, when they grow, start building their own lives, and sometimes the ledger doesn't balance. The realization hurt, but it also gave me something else: clarity. I couldn't keep holding on to the version of him that lived in my memories. He wasn't that boy anymore, and I wasn't the woman he thoughtlessly admired. I was something else now, older, quieter, but still here. And maybe it was time I started seeing myself as more than just the shadow in the background of his life. The next morning, I made a decision. Small but mine. I went to the market and bought fresh fabric, a color I hadn't worn in years. It was bold, brighter than I usually chose. The shopkeeper asked if it was for a special occasion, and I smiled, saying no. It was for me. That evening, I stitched it into a simple dress. For the first time in a long while, I looked at myself in the mirror and saw someone I hadn't met in years. Someone who deserved to exist beyond what others thought or said. The quiet distance with my son remained, but I was beginning to understand something. Silence could break you, but it could also rebuild you. It depended on what you did with it. I had spent weeks letting it suffocate me. Now, I wanted to see if I could let it teach me instead. The voice message still haunted me, but it no longer felt like an ending. It felt like a doorway. Painful, yes, but opening toward something I couldn't yet name. And as I folded the new dress and placed it neatly in my cupboard, I whispered to myself words I hadn't spoken in a long time. I still have more life to live. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even confidence, but it was a beginning. It started with little things no one else would notice, but I did. I changed the curtains in the living room, choosing a lighter fabric that let more sunlight in. I rearranged the furniture, moving the chair I used to sit in closer to the window. I began cooking meals in smaller portions, enough for one person instead of waiting for visitors who didn't come as often anymore. They were ordinary changes, but they carried weight. For years, my life had moved in rhythm with my son's needs, his schedule, his preferences. Now, in the quiet left behind, I was beginning to move at my own pace. The silence of the house still pressed heavily on me, but it no longer felt entirely like punishment. Sometimes it felt like space. I noticed it most on Sunday mornings. That used to be our time. He would come over, and we'd share breakfast. But lately, those visits had become rare. The first Sunday I spent alone, I sat at the table waiting, my tea growing cold. The second Sunday, I set 1 cup instead of 2. By the third, I brewed only for myself. It was a small adjustment, but with each step, I realized I was learning to live without expectation. One afternoon, I went for a walk through the old park near our neighborhood. I hadn't been there in years. Children were playing on the swings, their laughter carrying across the air. I watched their mothers standing nearby, calling out reminders, their hands full of snacks and water bottles. For a moment, I was pulled back to the days when that was me, my son tugging at my sleeve, asking for one more push, one more turn. A young woman next to me smiled, her child clinging to her leg. "Are you waiting for someone?" she asked kindly. I shook my head. "No, just passing by." She nodded, distracted as her child ran off again. I stayed a while longer, then walked home slowly. The memories didn't hurt as sharply as I expected. Instead, they reminded me of how much had changed, and how much I had survived. That evening, when my son called, I answered with a steadier voice. We spoke about his work, his wife, the errands of his day. He didn't ask much about me, and I didn't offer much either. But when he said, "I'll try to come by next week," I found myself replying, "Don't worry, take your time." It wasn't bitterness, it was acceptance. Later, I sat by the window in the new dress I had stitched, the one I had bought just for myself. The fabric felt unfamiliar, but in a good way. I thought about how much of my life I had given to others without question, without pause. Now, for the first time, I was beginning to see that I could give some of it back to myself. Still, the ache of his words remained. Some nights, when the house was too quiet, I would hear his voice from that message in my head, the carelessness in his tone. "She's becoming too much," he had said. I wondered if he knew how deeply those words had settled in me, how they had cracked something I thought was unbreakable. But here was the strange part. That crack had also let something new in. A question I had never asked myself before. Who am I, apart from being his mother? It wasn't an easy question, and I didn't have the answer, but even asking it felt like progress. The next week, I joined a small group at the community center. They met on Wednesdays to learn embroidery. I had always known the basics, but this was different. Sitting in that room with women my age, laughing softly over uneven stitches, I felt a kind of belonging I hadn't expected. It wasn't family, but it was connection. When I told my son later, he sounded distracted. "That's nice, Amma," he said quickly, before moving on to another topic. I smiled anyway. His approval wasn't the point. For so long I had lived through him, his successes, his failures, his milestones. But life was showing me that there was still more left for me too, even if it didn't look like it once did. That night, I wrote in a small notebook I had found in the back of a drawer. A single line. "I am learning to exist without waiting." The words weren't perfect, but they were mine. And as I closed the notebook and placed it on the nightstand, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, a quiet steadiness. The kind that doesn't erase the pain, but makes it easier to carry. It was still his voice that had shaken me. But now it was my own that was beginning to guide me forward. It was an ordinary Tuesday when he finally looked at me differently. I hadn't been expecting it. He stopped by after work, his tie loose, his eyes heavy from the day. Usually these visits were quick, squeezed between meetings and home. But this time, as he stepped into the living room, he paused. "New curtains?" he asked, his brow lifting slightly. I nodded. "Yes, I thought it was time for a change." He looked around for a moment, as though he hadn't realized how much had shifted since his last visit. The lighter fabric, the rearranged furniture, the bright dress folded neatly on the chair. It wasn't much, but in his eyes I saw a flicker of recognition, that I was not standing still, waiting for him as I always had. We sat down to tea. I didn't hover the way I used to, watching if he needed more sugar, more milk, more comfort. I poured once, then let him take care of the rest. At first, the silence between us felt familiar, heavy, but something about it was different now. I wasn't waiting for him to fill it. I wasn't reaching across it either. I was just there, steady in my own skin. He asked about the embroidery group, his voice casual. I told him we had started a new design, something intricate that kept my evenings occupied. "That's good, Amma," he said. But this time he looked at me longer. Maybe he was trying to measure the shift in me. Maybe he was realizing that my life didn't orbit entirely around his anymore. Later, as he leaned back in his chair, he sighed. "I've been busy," he said softly. "Sometimes I don't even realize how much time passes," I wanted to say. I know. I wanted to tell him that I had heard his words in that message, that I had carried them like a stone in my chest. But instead, I chose something else. "I understand," I said quietly. "We all get busy. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't confrontation. It was something in between, something truer." His eyes shifted, and for the first time in weeks, I felt he was really seeing me. That night, after he left, I sat in the chair by the window. The street was quiet, the hum of the city low in the distance. I thought about the years I had spent centering my life around his needs, believing that was the only way to be a mother. Now, I realized, there was another way, to let him have his life while I quietly rebuilt mine. A few days later, he called in the middle of the afternoon. Not with news, not with a request, just to ask, "Have you eaten?" It was a small question, but it stayed with me. Maybe he was remembering the countless times I had asked him the same. Maybe he was realizing that the bond between us wasn't made of duty alone, but something deeper, something fragile, yet enduring. Still, I didn't let myself hope too much. I knew relationships weren't rebuilt overnight. The distance between us was real, and so were the wounds his words had left. But I could feel something shifting. In him, in me, in the space we shared. That Sunday, when he came again, he noticed the notebook on the table. "You've been writing?" he asked. I hesitated, then nodded. "Just thoughts. Nothing important." He picked it up, flipping through the pages without reading them. "That's good, Amma. It suits you." It was such a simple sentence, but it lingered in the room long after he set the notebook down. For years, I had only been seen as his mother, caretaker, comforter, background figure. Now, for the first time, he was beginning to see me as a person with her own life, her own inner world. That evening, when I wrote again, my words came easier. I am more than what was said about me. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't bitterness. It was truth. I didn't know what the next days would bring. I didn't know if the distance would close completely, or if some part of it would always remain. But I did know this. The silence no longer belonged to him. It belonged to me, and I was learning how to live within it, how to turn it into strength instead of sorrow. And perhaps slowly, he was learning too. The seasons shifted quietly. Summer heat gave way to the cool evenings of autumn, and with it, something inside me began to settle. The ache of his words had not disappeared, but it no longer consumed me the way it once did. Pain, I realized, doesn't always leave. Sometimes it learns to live beside you, quieter with each passing day. My son visited more often now, not as he once did, full of boyish eagerness, but with a softer presence. He would sit longer at the table, ask me about the embroidery projects, even notice the meals I cooked for myself. They weren't grand gestures, but they were something. Perhaps he was learning, in his own way, that parents grow old, not into burdens, but into people who need to be seen differently. One evening, as he cleared the cups after tea, I stopped him. "Leave it," I said gently. "I'll do it." He looked at me a little surprised, then nodded. For years I had hovered, making sure everything was done for him. Now I didn't need to. There was strength in letting go of those habits, in not binding myself to the old rhythms. Later that night, I sat with my notebook open, staring at the page. The words came slowly but steadily. I cannot change what I heard, but I can choose what I carry forward. The choice mattered. For months, I had carried his words like a wound. Now, I wanted to carry something else. The truth that my life still had meaning, with or without his constant attention. A week later, we sat together after dinner. The house was quiet, and I don't know what gave me the courage, but I spoke. "I heard something once," I began, my voice even. "Something you said." It wasn't meant for me. His face tensed. "Amma," I raised my hand gently. "It hurt, more than I can say, but I don't want it to stay between us like a shadow." For a moment, he looked at me, his eyes searching mine. Then he lowered his gaze. "I was careless," he whispered. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded." The silence after his words was long, but it didn't feel heavy this time. I nodded. We all say things without thinking. I've done it too. It wasn't forgiveness in the way he might have hoped, but it was release, for me, if not for him. The truth had been spoken aloud, and with it, some of the weight lifted. When he left that evening, he hugged me longer than usual. His arms were firm, his cheek pressed to mine. "I'll come by soon," he said, and for the first time in months, I believed him. After he left, I walked to the mirror. The woman looking back at me was older, yes, but not diminished. She was still learning, still living, still capable of change. She was more than a role, more than the label of mother. She was herself. That night, I wrote my final line in the notebook. Love does not end when it changes shape. And neither do I. I closed the book, placed it gently on the table, and turned off the light. The house was quiet, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like space. Space I had earned. Space I could finally call my own. And in that quiet, I understood. The message that once broke me had also given me something unexpected. A different kind of closeness. Not just with my son, but with myself. In the end, one mistaken message didn't just expose a betrayal. It revealed the true strength of love, loyalty, and trust. Sometimes, the hardest truths give us the clearest answers. If this story touched you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more emotional journeys that stay with you long after the video ends.